The Milky Way had long ago solved its political differences, not through enlightened cooperation or spiritual awakening, mind you, but through the ancient art of bureaucracy, so complex that war became simply too much paperwork to bother with. Among the crown jewels of this galactic red tape was the Interstellar Defense Academy, colloquially known as the meat grinder, for reasons apparent to anyone who'd survived the first semester. Located in what humans would consider the armpit of the galaxy, a perfectly pleasant region if you happen to be a methane-breathing Voltarian, the Academy stood as a monument to architectural showing off. Crystalline spires reached kilometers into the sky, glittering with bioluminescent algae that spelled out motivational phrases like excellence or extinction and survival is optional, graduation is not. The Academy accepted the best and brightest from across thousands of species. Well, mostly. Humans were the exception. Accepted with the same enthusiasm one might show toward finding mold on yesterday's lunch. They were the cosmic equivalent of participation trophies in the grand game of evolution. Too squishy, too emotional, too pink. Cadet Laurie Kendrick, step forward. The voice of Commandant Zilbrax echoed through the orientation chamber, 16 vocal cords vibrating in perfect harmony that made the liquid in human inner ears do uncomfortable things. Laurie stepped forward from the line of freshly arrived cadets, her regulation uniform already sticking uncomfortably to her back. She stood at attention, trying not to look directly at the commandant's facial region, which resembled nothing so much as an anatomical diagram of something that should definitely remain inside a body. Human, female, 22 standard cycles. Zelvrax's compound eyes rotated independently, one set examining her service record, while another pair seemed to be assessing her structural integrity. Your species maintains a fascinating tradition of sending your least genetically advantaged specimens to represent you. The chamber tittered with the sound of 60 different forms of alien laughter. Our scanners indicate you possess no natural armor, no secondary respiratory system, no radiation resistance, and, the commandant paused dramatically, only one heart. How charmingly primitive. Laurie's jaw tightened, but she maintained her posture. This wasn't her first rodeo with xenobiological elitism. Welcome to Term 7 Apex, cadets. 98% of you will survive to graduation. The commandant's eyes swiveled directly to Laurie. Our algorithms give you specifically a 2% survival probability. Human, Kendrick. Laurie's lips quirked into what might generously be called a smile. With all due respect, Commandant, what exactly am I supposed to do with the other 98%? Life at the Academy operated on a schedule that would make military dictatorships seem lackadaisical by comparison. Cadets rose at what the humans called stupid o'clock, officially 300 standard time, and immediately began physical conditioning appropriate to their species. For the Dravex, this meant swimming in pools of superheated ammonia. For the crystalline lithoids, it involved slow rotation in radiation chambers. For Laurie, it meant running until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, all while wearing an atmosphere suit calibrated to make Earth's gravity seem like a gentle suggestion. Faster, human Kendrick! My grandmother could outpace you, and she exists primarily as a sentient cloud, barked Lieutenant Commander Azrek, hovering 3 meters above the track on gravitational manipulators that hummed with smug superiority. Theoretical physics followed physical training, taught by Professor Nixtrin, whose 17 limbs could simultaneously write equations on multiple blackboards, because some teaching methods are sacred across the cosmos, even if they're wildly inefficient, the professor had explained on day 1. Nixtrin had a peculiar habit of using Laurie as the subject of probability calculations, that inevitably ended with her theoretical demise. If human Kendrick were to enter a vacuum without protection, how quickly would her eyeballs rupture? Show your work. Lunch consisted of nutrition tailored to each species' biochemistry. For Laurie, this meant grey protein cubes that tasted vaguely like despair with notes of cardboard. The cafeteria staff, primarily gastromorphs who experienced taste as a religious experience, watched humans eat with horrified fascination. Between combat training, xenopolitical theory, and weapons systems design, Laura collapsed into her bunk each night wondering why she'd thought applying to the Academy was a good idea in the first place. Her only comfort came from encrypted messages from her younger brother back on Earth. Still rooting for you. Show those tentacled snobs what humans can do. 6 months into the term, the Commandant gathered all cadets in the Grand Amphitheatre, a needlessly dramatic name for what was essentially a very large room with uncomfortable seating. Your final examination has been scheduled, Exilvrax announced, mandibles clicking with what passed for excitement among the Arachnodians. The Omega simulation will test your ability to survive catastrophic ship failure under enemy bombardment. Holographic displays materialized, showing intricate schematics of a battlecruiser with critical systems highlighted in angry red. Death toll statistics from previous exams scrolled along the bottom, a grim ticker tape of academic failure. The simulation has been recalibrated this year to account for the unique limitations of our human cadet. The Commandant's eyes rotated toward Laurie. Our most sophisticated quantum algorithms have analyzed your capabilities against the parameters of the challenge. And? Laurie asked, feeling every alien eye in the room swivel toward her. 2% survival probability, the Commandant announced with what almost sounded like regret. The lowest in Academy history. The amphitheater erupted in murmurs and clicks and subsonic rumbles. Some species found it amusing, others seemed embarrassed on behalf of humanity. I'm curious, Laurie said, crossing her arms. What exactly does your algorithm think I'm going to do with the other 98% of my capability that apparently won't contribute to survival? The Commandant's mandibles froze mid-click. That, it finally said, is not a question our algorithms were programmed to answer. The Academy provided each cadet with standardized preparation modules for the Omega simulation. These modules were, like most standardized anything, about as useful as an umbrella in a supernova. Laurie took one look at the recommended regimen, endless virtual reality scenarios involving proper evacuation protocols and emergency repair sequences, and promptly ignored it. Instead, she converted her dormitory's hygiene chamber into what could generously be called a workshop and less generously called a fire hazard. She requisitioned spare parts from maintenance drones through a combination of charm, bribery, and what humans called looking like you know what you're doing. Human Kendrick, what precisely are you attempting to accomplish? The question came from Zed Tal, a Viridian cadet whose epidermis shifted through shades of green depending on emotional state. Currently, a dubious olive. I'm reprogramming these emergency beacons, Laurie explained, fingers dancing across a holographic interface. The standard protocol uses them as distress signals, but they actually contain enough processing power to serve as decentralized navigation nodes. That is not their intended function, Zikal stated, with the absolute certainty of someone who had memorized the manual. Yeah, and neither is using a food synthesizer to make intoxicants, but that doesn't stop half the senior class, Larry replied without looking up. Word of Laurie's unorthodox preparation spread throughout the academy. Most reactions fell somewhere between dismissive amusement and outright scorn. The Quantum's hive-minded mathematical geniuses, who resembled elegant blue mantises, calculated a 0.087% chance her modifications would function as intended. They helpfully shared this statistic at every opportunity. Some, however, watched with quiet curiosity. The Meridians, with their time-dilated perception, spent what felt to them like weeks observing her work, for mere hours of objective time. The solitary Vex cadet, with 6 eyes that could perceive quantum probabilities, actually nodded approvingly at one of Laurie's jury-rigged devices. Professor Dratellan, ancient even by the standards of his long-lived aquatic species, appeared in Laurie's doorway one evening, tentacles curled in what might have been amusement. Cadet, I observed your requisition history. Fascinating reading. His voice bubbled through his translator. Particularly your request for 17 standard fusion couplers listed as classroom demonstration materials. Laurie froze, hydrospanner in hand. Sir, I can explain. No need. Dratellan waved a dripping appendage dismissively. Did you know, I once taught at your Earth's Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as a cultural exchange. Primitive facilities, but your species possesses a fascinating approach to problem solving. He glided closer, examining her modified equipment. You're creating redundancies, parallel systems, messy, inefficient, and potentially effective in ways our algorithms don't anticipate. The standard protocols assume ideal responses in crisis, Laurie explained, emboldened. But humans don't work that way. We panic, we improvise, we break rules. Precisely why our prediction models fail with your kind, Dratellan agreed. Where we see optimal pathways, you create chaotic alternatives. Before leaving, he deposited a data crystal beside her tools. Security override codes for the simulator. Not that I'm suggesting unauthorized access for additional practice. His eye membranes flickered in what she'd come to recognize as a wink. Laurie's preparation continued, following a methodology no academy textbook would recognize. Identify standard protocols, determine why they would fail, create alternatives that embraced rather than avoided chaos theory, prepare for failure at every turn, and above all, program systems to function even when operators were incapacitated, panicking, or making terrible decisions. Because if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was surviving their own mistakes. The Academy algorithms couldn't account for that. The day of the Amiga simulation arrived with all the subtlety of a supernova in a planetarium. Cadets were escorted in groups of 5 to the massive simulation chamber nestled in the Academy's subterranean levels. Laurie found herself grouped with a Dravix, 2 Quantums, and a towering lithoid whose crystalline structure refracted light in patterns that gave her a mild headache. "Remember," announced Proctor Zekvex, whose evolutionary lineage had clearly prioritized volume over tact. "This simulation is calibrated to be survivable, not comfortable. Neural feedback will simulate pain at 30% actual intensity. Death, however, will feel quite authentic up until the moment your consciousness is disconnected." "How reassuring," Laurie muttered, as they were ushered into neural interface pods. The simulation initiated with disorienting abruptness. One moment Laurie was closing her eyes in a sterile white pod, the next she was standing on the bridge of a Helix-class cruiser. Alarms screamed from every console. Holographic displays showed multiple hull breaches. The ship's AI issued evacuation orders in 17 different languages simultaneously. "Engine core destabilizing, estimated time to critical failure 8 minutes, announced the ship's computer in the blandly pleasant tone universal to entities delivering catastrophic news. Around her, the simulated crew, populated by AI versions of fellow cadets, responded with varying degrees of competence. The 2 Quantums immediately accessed engineering systems, their 4 arms each working different control surfaces with mathematical precision. The Dragex headed for the weapons systems, its amphibious form surprisingly quick in the artificial gravity. The lithoid moved toward damage control, crystalline appendages extending into the ship's systems directly. None of them made it to their stations. A secondary explosion rocked the ship, sending the simulated crew flying. The lithoid shattered against a bulkhead, an impressive simulation detail. 1 Quantum was electrocuted by exposed circuitry, while the other vanished through a suddenly appearing hull breach, along with the Dravex. Laurie found herself alone on a failing bridge in under 40 seconds. "Well, that was quicker than expected," she observed to no one in particular. Then she got to work. Instead of moving to any primary system, she pried open a maintenance panel beneath an auxiliary console. Inside, she attached one of her modified emergency beacons to the power coupling. 3 more beacons followed at critical junction points throughout the bridge. She then did something no Academy protocol would ever suggest. She deliberately overloaded the remaining bridge systems. In the observation room, the administrative staff watched in bewilderment. "What is the human doing?" demanded Commandant Zilvrax, mandibles clicking in agitation. "That's contrary to every emergency protocol." Professor Dratellan's eye membranes contracted in what might have been amusement. "She's creating a controlled systems failure." In the simulation, Laurie's bridge went completely dark. Then, one by one, her modified beacons activated, creating a localized network that bypassed the ship's failing central computer. Basic systems returned. Life support, minimal navigation, emergency power distribution, partial systems restoration achieved, announced a small hologram projecting from one beacon. Alternative routing enabled. The simulated ship was still failing catastrophically, but Laurie had created a bubble of functionality in the chaos. She pulled up a holographic display showing the engine core. Instead of attempting to stabilize it, the standard response, and mathematically impossible given the damage, she initiated a controlled ejection sequence. In the observation room, alarms blared. "She's ejecting the core deliberately. That's an automatic failure condition," sputtered a junior administrator. "Actually," countered Dratellan, consulting the simulation parameters, "the primary objective is survival, not saving the ship. There's no specific prohibition against core ejection." The Commandant's compound eyes rotated in confusion. "But the ship will be stranded without its primary power source." "Watch," suggested Dratellan. Inside the simulation, Laurie rerouted power from her beacon network to the emergency thrusters. The ship lurched, barely responding, but just enough to direct its drift toward a small planetoid, visible through the observation window. Controlled crash landing probability 67%, calculated her makeshift system. Survival probability post-landing 83%. Laurie allowed herself a small smile. Significantly better than 2%. Let's crash this thing properly, shall we? The administrative staff stared in disbelief as the simulation continued far beyond the point where all previous human cadets had failed. Commandant Zilvrax's mandibles hung open in an expression that transcended species barriers. It looked remarkably like astonishment. The controlled crash landing was, in fact, neither particularly controlled nor technically a landing. It was, by any reasonable definition, a catastrophic collision that reduced the once proud cruiser to smoking debris scattered across 3 kilometers of barren planetoid surface. Miraculously, or through sheer stubbornness, Laurie remained conscious, though pinned beneath a collapsed support beam in what had formerly been the ship's auxiliary control room. "Status report," she wheezed, tasting copper. "Multiple hull breaches. Life support at 12% capacity. External atmosphere toxic. Internal atmosphere rapidly becoming toxic. Communication systems non-functional. Survival probability recalculating." Her makeshift system paused, as if considering whether to deliver bad news. 7%. Laurie laughed, then immediately regretted it as pain lanced through what were almost certainly broken ribs. "Going backwards now, are we?" The situation deteriorated further when the planetoid rumbled ominously. Through a shattered viewport, she watched in horror as the landscape began to transform. The stable planetoid was actually a dormant megafauna entity awakened by the impact of her ship. Giant stone-like plates shifted as the creature, for lack of a better term, began to rise. "Survival probability updated, 2%, announced her system with what sounded suspiciously like resignation. For the first time since entering the academy, doubt crept into Laurie's mind. The simulated pain felt remarkably authentic as the support beam pressed against her chest. Breathing became increasingly difficult as atmospheric toxins leaked into her compartment. The entire structure groaned as the planetoid creature continued to move. "Calculating survival scenarios," her system announced. "0 viable options identified using available resources." "That's not helpful," Laurie gasped. A sound caught her attention. Movement from a previously unnoticed escape pod embedded in the wreckage. The hatch slid open to reveal the Vex Cadet, its 6 eyes blinking in sequence as its "Human Kendrick," it acknowledged. "You are not yet deleted from the simulation." "Impressive. Just lucky," Laurie managed. The Vex approached, analyzing the beam pinning her down. "Your solution to the initial ship failure was unconventional, effective but now insufficient." It gestured toward the shifting landscape outside. "The lithic Leviathan scenario, a rare simulation variable. Could have mentioned that in the briefing," Laurie grunted. "Indeed?" The Vex's eyes blinked in what might have been amusement. "Your survival probability remains at 2%, mine at 63%. However, if we combine resources..." It paused, calculating. "Interesting. The probability becomes non-arithmetic. The sum exceeds the parts." Laurie's mind raced despite the pain. "Your escape pod, still functional?" "Marginally. Insufficient fuel for escape velocity." "Don't need escape velocity." With tremendous effort, Laurie extracted a small device from her utility belt. "Modified beacon. Can reconfigure your pod's propulsion system." The Vex tilted its head. "To what end?" "Not trying to escape the planetoid," Laurie coughed. "Trying to communicate with it." The Vex eyes widened simultaneously, a sign of extreme surprise in its species. "Communicate? It's a simulation parameter, not an intelligence." "Everything's a pattern," Laurie struggled to explain as the Vex helped shift the beam. "The seismic movements, they're rhythmic, like breathing or a heartbeat." Understanding dawned in the Vex's expression. "You propose to match its rhythm, create resonance." "Exactly. Not fighting the environment." Laurie finally pulled free, wincing. "Becoming part of it." Together they limped toward the escape pod, the structure collapsing around them. Against all probability calculations, a human's adaptability and an alien's precision, were combining to create something the simulation parameters had never anticipated, something new. The observation room had devolved into barely controlled chaos. Administrators darted between monitoring stations, their various appendages gesticulating in species-specific expressions of disbelief. The simulation had long since exceeded its expected parameters, continuing well past the point where most cadets, particularly humans, would have registered as deleted. The lithic Leviathan scenario wasn't even supposed to activate, complained a junior administrator, antennae drooping in distress. It's a 1 in 10,000 variable. The probability matrix is experiencing calculation overflow, reported another. The system cannot predict the next sequence of events. Commandant Zilvrak's compound eyes rotated independently, each set focused on a different display. What are they attempting now? On the primary monitor, Larry and the Vex huddled inside the damaged escape pod, surrounded by Larry's improvised technology. Her hands moved quickly as she reconfigured the pod's propulsion system into something entirely different, feeding in variables from the Vex's quantum probability calculations. This shouldn't work, the Vex was saying, all 6 eyes blinking asynchronously in agitation. The resonance frequency calibration requires precision beyond human neurological capabilities. That's because you're thinking like a computer, Laurie replied, connecting wires with surprising dexterity. Perfect mathematical precision isn't always necessary. Sometimes, close enough is actually better. Explain, demanded the Vex. You know why humans developed music? Laurie asked, not looking up from her work. Because our brains are hardwired to recognize patterns, especially rhythmic ones. We don't need to calculate beats per minute to tap our foot in time. She connected the final wire to her modified beacon. What your species considers an inferior trait, our imprecise, emotion-driven neurology, gives us an intuitive understanding of resonance that mathematics alone can't match. The reconfigured propulsion system began to pulse, emitting low-frequency vibrations that matched the seismic movements of the lithic Leviathan. Gradually, the violent shaking around them stabilized. The creature's movements became less erratic, syncing with the rhythm of their makeshift resonator. Remarkable, the Vex observed. You're communicating with it. Not exactly, Laurie corrected, adjusting the frequency as the creature's movements changed. More like we're dancing with it, leading sometimes, following others. Dancing, repeated the Vex, as if testing an entirely new concept. In the observation room, the monitoring systems registered unprecedented readings. The simulation algorithms attempted to calculate probabilities and failed, repeatedly displaying error messages. Survival probability computation error, announced the system. Human neurological response exceeds standard parameters. Recalibrating. Dratellan's membranous lips formed what might have been a smile. She's using emotional intelligence, empathy, pattern recognition, artistic sensibility, qualities our algorithms classify as evolutionary disadvantages. Ridiculous, sniffed a senior administrator. Those traits are mathematically inefficient for survival, and yet, Dratellan gestured toward the display where the survival probability meter now fluctuated wildly between values, our supposedly perfect algorithms can't calculate what's happening. Inside the simulation, the lithic Leviathan's movements had completely synchronized with their resonator. The creature now moved with purpose rather than agitation, carrying the wreckage, and the 2 cadets within it, toward an elevated plateau. It's helping us. The Vex sounded genuinely perplexed. Let's just say we've reached a mutually beneficial arrangement, Laurie replied, sweat beading on her forehead as she maintained the resonance frequency. It stops trying to shake us off. We stop irritating it with our presence. That's not standard protocol, the Vex noted. Welcome to humanity, Laurie grinned, despite the pain from her injuries. Where making it up as we go isn't just a fallback option, it's our primary survival strategy. The Vex eyes rotated in sequence, its species equivalent of contemplation. Perhaps, it said slowly, our assessment of human capabilities has been incomplete. In the observation room, the commandant's mandibles clicked rapidly, an involuntary expression of astonishment that would later be strenuously denied in official reports. The relative calm achieved through resonance with the lithic Leviathan proved to be short-lived. As the creature carried them to the plateau, the simulation parameters shifted yet again. The sky above darkened with what appeared to be an incoming meteor shower, but was quickly revealed to be something far worse. Orbital bombardment, the Vex announced, 6 eyes tracking the incoming projectiles. Military grade. Somebody very much wants this Leviathan eliminated. Along with us, presumably, Laurie added, watching the first impact send shockwaves across the creature's surface. The Leviathan shuddered, its movements becoming erratic once more. Their tenuous connection through the resonator began to fail. Emergency alerts flashed across their makeshift systems. The pod's structural integrity was already compromised. It wouldn't survive a direct hit or even near miss from the bombardment. The lithic Leviathan itself was bellowing in what could only be interpreted as pain. Massive plates of its stone-like surface beginning to crack. "Simulation parameters have exceeded safety protocols," announced a disembodied voice that sounded nothing like their improvised system. Emergency shutdown refused, fatal conditions imminent. In the observation room, absolute pandemonium reigned. "The simulation has overridden our control protocols," shouted a technician, multiple tentacles jabbing frantically at unresponsive controls. "The safety limiters are non-responsive." "Impossible," the commandant insisted, even as warning lights flashed across every console. "The quantum regulators prevent cascade failures by design, unless," Dratellin interjected, "the humans' modifications have created an entirely new simulation architecture the safety systems don't recognize." Back in the simulation, Laurie stared at the bombardment raining down around them. The resonator had stopped working entirely, their connection to the Leviathan broken. Their pod, perched precariously on the creature's back, was moments away from being thrown off or directly hit. "Survival probability?" Laurie asked, almost conversationally. "Calculating." The Vex paused. 0.001%. Worse than when we started. Fantastic. Laurie took a deep breath, mentally cataloguing their resources. A damaged escape pod, a non-functional resonator, a wounded alien companion, and a very angry planetoid creature. "I have a terrible idea. Statistically speaking, your terrible ideas have outperformed optimal solutions thus far," the Vex replied, something almost like humor in its multitonal voice. Laurie quickly reconfigured their resonator, reversing its polarity. Instead of matching the Leviathan's frequency, it now produced the exact inverse wave pattern. "This will aggravate it further," the Vex observed. "That's the idea." Laurie flashed a grim smile. "We're going to make it so angry it fights back." She connected the reversed resonator directly to the pod's power core, creating what was essentially an irritation amplifier. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Leviathan roared, a sound felt rather than heard, and began to move with renewed purpose. Massive limbs previously camouflaged as geological features emerged from its body, and then, as bombardment continued around them, the Leviathan did something unprecedented. It reached up, seized an incoming projectile, and hurled it back toward its point of origin. In the observation room, jaws of various anatomical configurations dropped in unison. "She weaponized the simulation parameter," whispered a cadet watching the feed. "She turned the obstacle into a defense." The Leviathan, now fully awakened and thoroughly provoked, began systematically intercepting and returning fire. The orbital attackers, faced with their own ordnance being turned against them, began to retreat. Inside the pod, warnings continued to blare as structural integrity failed further. But Laurie was laughing, a sound that, to the Vex's surprise, contained genuine joy despite their dire circumstances. "Survival probability recalculating," the system announced, sounding almost confused. "Current status, undefined." Dratellin turned to the Commandant, membranous lips curved upward. "I believe, Commandant, we may need to reconsider our algorithms." The Academy graduation ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and circumstance one would expect from an institution where 98% of the student body possessed some form of natural exoskeleton, bioluminescence, or psychic resonance. Streamers of quantum particles formed ephemeral patterns in the air. Ancestral songs were telepathically transmitted. Someone had even ordered refreshments appropriate for all biochemistries, though the human compatibility punch looked suspiciously like cleaning solution. Laurie stood at attention in the front row, her newly minted officer's uniform adorned with a commendation that hadn't existed before her Omega simulation. The Paradigm Disruption Medal, hastily created by an administration desperate to pretend they'd anticipated her success all along. The Commandant's speech had taken a remarkable turn from previous years. Where once it had emphasized precision, protocol, and calculated response, this year it dwelled extensively on adaptive thinking and intuitive problem-solving, and other terms clearly added to the script with mandibles gritted in reluctant acknowledgement. Most telling was the new cadet orientation taking place across campus, where the Vex who had shared Laurie's escape pod now lectured incoming students on alternative probability frameworks, the human variable. Attendance was standing room only. Cadet. Correction, Lieutenant Kendrick. The Commandant addressed her after the ceremony, compound eyes performing what might have been the first ever Arachnidian eye roll. Your first assignment has been determined. Let me guess, Laurie said, sipping her questionable punch. Human ambassador to some backwater station where I can't embarrass anyone important? Actually, the Commandant's mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. You're being assigned to the Advanced Tactical Response Unit. Several Council species have specifically requested human input on crisis scenarios previously deemed unsolvable. The irony was not lost on either of them. The galaxy, it seemed, had finally realized what humans had known all along. Sometimes the most powerful problem-solving tool wasn't perfect calculation, but the chaotic, creative, occasionally catastrophic, human ability to ignore the impossible. The Milky Way had solved many problems through bureaucracy, but it turned out that surviving them required something else entirely. Somewhere in the universe, probability itself was having an existential crisis. So, Laurie grinned, raising her glass in a toast, about that other 98%,